Today, I'm giving the solution to the biggest problem in culturing blackworms at home. And if you're with the original blackworm breeder box method, that's great. It's keeping worms in a little box that hang on a tank you already have. Plus, you can use the muck from the bottom of your fish tanks to feed them. Throw some additional fish food in there a few times a week, and you have blackworms. So, what if your culture is not producing enough worms for you to actually use? My old solution was, well, start a couple more cultures. But now you have another option. So, check out what the issues are standing between you and a pound of worms, and I'll be back to explain more.
Welcome to The Explainer. Look, if you've ever spent time cultivating live food for your aquatic setups, you probably know the exact hair-pulling frustration we are going to tackle today. It's the classic bottleneck, right? Your blackworms are surviving, they actually look pretty healthy, but they absolutely refuse to multiply. You're putting in all this work, but your colony just stays the exact same size week after week. It's honestly like staring at a stubborn, unchanging puddle of mud. Well, today, we are going to unpack a biological blueprint that flips this entire problem on its head. Okay, let's dive into this, because this is really the core mystery that plagues almost every standard home culture out there. Why does your setup just hit a brick wall? To understand this bottleneck, we first have to uncover what these organisms are actually capable of when we take the brakes off. The answer isn't that blackworms are naturally slow breeders. Actually, scratch that, it's the exact opposite. The real issue is that we just haven't been giving them what they need to truly thrive. And why? Because doing so in a traditional setup would completely destroy their environment. So, to see what they are truly capable of, we can turn to established laboratory data. Researchers who cultivate this specific blackworm species found that temperature is a massive, absolutely crucial driver of reproduction. And the magic number? It's 74 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 23 degrees Celsius. Think of this as their biological Goldilocks zone. In published protocols, giving them this perfect spa-like temperature is the foundational pillar that unlocks their absolute maximum metabolic and reproductive rates. And when they hit that Goldilocks zone, paired with optimal nutrition and high oxygen levels, the results are frankly staggering. Under these perfect laboratory conditions, blackworm populations have the biological capacity to double, literally double, every 10 to 14 days. Just think about that for a second. They aren't slow at all. Their natural biology is fundamentally wired for explosive exponential growth, provided all of their environmental and nutritional needs are perfectly met. And this brilliantly illustrates what a 10 to 14-day doubling rate actually looks like in practice. If we start at week 0 with just a single ounce of blackworms, by week 2, we have 2 ounces. By week 4, so we're talking just 20 to 28 days later, we have 4 ounces of solid wriggling biomass. That is a massive yield. But, and of course there's a but, here is the catch. Getting this kind of compounding math requires feeding the worms incredibly heavily, and that brings us right to the problem with how most of us have been doing this. Let's contrast two very different methods here. You might be totally familiar with the original blackworm breeder box method, where you use a fluval hang-on breeder box and some aquarium tank muck to provide a natural, carbon-rich substrate. Now, this is a fantastic, elegant solution for tiny little batches. But the moment you try to scale this up to produce ounces or even pounds of worms, it completely crashes. Commercial farms handle scaling by doing the exact opposite. They use massive flow-through systems, literally continuously pumping hundreds of gallons of fresh water over the worms just to constantly export all the waste. So why do the commercial guys need so much water? Well, it all comes down to the math of sludge processing. Research shows that to maximize reproduction, a single ounce of blackworms can process an astonishing amount of organic material. Even if we take the experimental data and cut it completely in half just to be incredibly conservative, we are still looking at 6.4 grams of dry organic material required per ounce of worms every single day. For a hobbyist to put that into perspective, that is a massive handful of pellets. It's an absolute mountain of food for a small home culture. So the crucial point is this. If you try to dump 6.4 grams of concentrated pellets directly into a typical breeder box or small home culture, it triggers a catastrophic chain reaction. The food decomposes rapidly, then microorganisms aggressively consume all the dissolved oxygen in the water, and toxic ammonia spikes to totally lethal levels. Nitrates and nitrates rapidly accumulate right behind it. Long before your blackworms can even take a single bite, the water quality completely fails and the whole culture crashes. This brings us to a major paradigm shift, and it's beautifully captured in this quote from the source material. It says, "I'm not testing the worm's nutritional capacity. I'm testing how much decomposing fish food my water can tolerate." Let that sink in for a second.
When we hold back on feeding because we're terrified of fouling the water, we are artificially capping the worm's population growth. The bottleneck isn't the worm's biology at all. No way. The bottleneck is strictly the limited carrying capacity of our culture water.
And this is where we introduce the real game changer, the biofloc breakthrough. If dumping massive amounts of food directly into the worm bed destroys the water, the answer is to decouple the system entirely. We have to separate the biological processing of the concentrated feed from the physical feeding of the blackworms. We use biofloc technology, which relies on beneficial, heterotrophic microorganisms to eat the waste and do all the heavy lifting for us, completely outside of the worm's actual living quarters. Let's move to and see how this builds into a highly efficient closed-loop system. Step 1, instead of feeding the worms directly, we add those massive amounts of premium concentrated food into a separate, dedicated container called a biofloc reactor. Step 2, the microorganisms in that reactor rapidly process the waste, safely capturing the nitrogen. Step 3, we harvest that resulting microbial biomass, the actual biofloc itself. And finally, Step 4, we feed that safe, pre-processed microbial biomass directly to our blackworms. We deliver all that dense nutrition without the toxic ammonia stike.
Now, the original laboratory studies used a pretty basic trout starter feed. But to really optimize this at scale for high-quality live food at home, we want to feed our biofloc reactor with premium, highly digestible proteins. Excellent choices for this include fluval bug bites, specifically looking at their bottom feeder, tropical, and cichlid granule formulas, as well as Sakari sinking carnivore pellets. By processing these premium inputs through the biofloc reactor first, we are creating incredibly nutrient-dense, perfectly safe biomass for the worms to gorge on.
But listen, there is one absolute, non-negotiable rule to make this separate reactor work: a massive, high oxygen requirement. You simply cannot overlook this step. We are deliberately encouraging an enormous amount of microbial activity in that reactor to break down those premium pellets, and those microbes need huge amounts of oxygen to process all that nitrogen safely and effectively. You absolutely cannot run a static or semi-static biofloc reactor. It requires intense, continuous aeration, think heavy bubbling and big air stones, to support that immense biological oxygen demand.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the final payoff for the water column. By separating the feeding and using biofloc to safely handle that massive nutrient load, we totally eliminate the need for those commercial flow-through systems that waste hundreds and hundreds of gallons. Instead of constant flushing, this setup slashes your daily water replacement down to just 5 to 10%. Literally, we only replace what evaporates, or what we inevitably siphon out when we're harvesting the worms. It is an incredibly resource-efficient way to scale.
So we've seen how locking in that 74-degree temperature, ensuring high oxygen, and using biofloc to safely process premium foods can unlock that explosive 10 to 14-day doubling rate, which leaves us with one final, provocative question to think about. How fast could your live food reproduce if you provided all the nutrition they could handle without destroying their water quality? The biological potential is absolutely there, just waiting to be unleashed. It's really just a matter of changing the blueprint. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this transforms the way you think about scaling your cultures.
So now you understand the major hurdle between making a couple ounces of worms and making pounds of worms at home. Feeding your blackworms enough that they can reproduce by doubling population every 14 days requires a tremendous amount of food. And unless you can tap into a natural water source, it's almost impossible to do at home until now.